Hey everybody, Pastor Scott here. Just wanted to continue to speak about these supplemental materials that we have been going through this month. Throughout this month of May, we've been focusing on how to build spiritually healthy families here at the Stanton First Church of God. And last week, I discussed a little bit on how to have harmony within the relationship. So today I want to talk a little bit more about kind of what happens when we no longer have that harmony in the relationship, and what are some of the falling out of that, of having that disharmony in the relationship. And probably one of the most common things that we think about is when people begin to start thinking or start having affairs. And that is a very damaging time for any relationship, because when you see the person that is your spouse, your significant other, and when you find out that they have been cheating on you with another individual on a physical aspect, then that really tears everything apart. Just looking at statistics, and these statistics are back from last year, 2017. When you look at one third of marriages, one or both partners admit to cheating on their spouse. 22% of men have cheated on their wives. 14% of women admitted to cheat on their significant others. 36% of both men and women have admitted to having an affair with a coworker. Um, we even see things like 17% of men or women have admitted to having an affair with a brother-in-law or a sister-in-law. So we see there's a lot of these statistics out there, but probably the more shocking things are what's happening within the church. We see a lot of crazy statistics that we see from the Barna Group. And here's some of the statistics. Like, basically in America, 4 out of 10 people basically say that adultery is morally acceptable. And I don't really know what they mean by adultery, if they mean actually a physical affair, or does that mean, you know, pornography or anything like that. Like, I don't know what their definition of adultery is. But for Christians, 1 out of 10 basically say that it is morally acceptable to have an affair when they interview people who claim to be Christians. When we actually look inside the church, and this is very shocking to read this, but basically 45% of Christians indicate that they have done something sexually inappropriate, and that 23% have actually had a sexual affair, um, as a believer. So we see that these affairs are very, I would say, probably more common than what we would like to give credit to. Even though we're looking at like 20%, still that's significant within a church community, which we want to promote building healthy families, building healthy marriages. So that's very significant. But today I'm going to talk about non-sexual affairs. And these are the things that can have as much damage as a relationship. And these things can also lead to having physical affairs. So let's talk about number one. The first type of non-sexual affair, and probably one of the most common ones, is an emotional affair. So what is an emotional affair? An emotional affair is when a spouse has basically withdrawn emotional attachment to their significant other and has gone to another individual to share those intimate or those confidential details. When we think about Genesis chapter 3, where man proclaims that, the two shall become one flesh, we see that when the two become one flesh, it's not only a physicality, but it's also emotionally that they are connected. When we think about our spouses, our spouse is someone that we should be able to go to, that we should trust to talk about our fears, our dreams, when we are emotionally drained, anytime when we have these big emotional reactions, our spouse should be the ones that we should be able to communicate those informations to be able to find that connection. So when you are unable to emotionally invest into your spouse, you have all these emotions, all these things you want to get off your chest and say, so that you then begin to pour it to another individual. And especially when that individual is of the opposite sex, that's listening to you, that is giving you advice. It's very innocent at first because you may think, oh, this is somebody who is really cares about me, who's really wants to listen to what I have to say. And when it becomes innocent, then you start to build these investments. And kind of what Dr. Harley talks about in his book, His Needs, Her Needs, is that a lot of times when people are not depositing into your love bank, when they're not meeting your emotional needs, and somebody else is starting to make deposits into your emotional love bank, then you are instantly going to go to where you're getting the deposits. So if I'm with my spouse and I'm getting withdrawals out of my emotional love bank with my spouse, but I'm going to a coworker and I'm starting to get deposits, then I'm going to be more inclined to move towards this person. And a lot of times emotional affairs may stay as emotional. But usually, more times than not, mostly about 86% of these emotional affairs will turn into physical affairs. And that's kind of the thing. And what the hard part about an emotional affair is this is I knew an individual that I was counseling who basically was going through an emotional affair, and I was doing couples counseling. And it was interesting because the person who was emotionally attached to another person, which happened to be a coworker, this individual didn't see anything wrong with it. They just said, this was a coworker. I'm just kind of talking. We're sharing. We're doing all this stuff, just sharing and talking. And that's really it. So there's nothing wrong with that. But to the spouse, when we would do one-on-one counseling with each of them, when I would meet with the spouse, she would be in tears because as he's saying, oh, well, we're just talking, or sometimes during lunch, we'll go out to lunch and we'll just talk about things. No big deal. But then when he would come home to his wife, there was no discussion. There was no talking. There was no, hey, let's go out, or let's have my parents watch the kids so we can go out and have a nice day and just be able to talk. Like none of that was happening. So she's having an emotional breakdown because her spouse is not pouring into her, and he is getting poured into by another person. And especially some of the keys of an emotional affair is if you feel like that you're not getting your emotional needs by your spouse and you suspect that they're getting their emotional needs somewhere else, then there may be a problem. You may want to confront your spouse on that. The other thing, if you're the one who's in the emotional affair, here are some things that you need to think about. If you're talking to this individual, and let's just say coworker, because that's usually the higher percentage according to statistics, if a coworker is pouring into you, then that's kind of where, and you start to feel good about that, and you start to think about, and even when you're going home, you're still thinking about your coworker, and even just little things, like let's say you're just talking and you're laughing, and that person puts a hand on your hand or a hand on a shoulder, and it just resonates really deep with you, and it just starts to kind of feel these warm fuzzies start kind of exploding inside you, then there's a problem. And that's not just like, oh, we're good friends. No, that's leading to something else. So if you think that you are maybe going through an emotional affair, this is the time where you and your spouse need to communicate and try to get on the same page of meeting each other's emotional needs, or you need to go to counseling and try to get back on track so that your marriage can grow stronger and can thrive. Number two is family of origin. And most of the time, we don't think of this as a non sexual affair. Basically, when we think of family of origin, it's usually your family, the people who raised you. And this can be anyone who was a primary caregiving, whether it was your mom or dad, whether if you were from a single parent, if it was just one of them, if your grandparents raised you, or even if you were in foster care or adopted and you have a guardian and they made it, basically anybody who has a strong influence in your life. And the problem on why this is fair is because when you are in a marriage relationship, you're not 100% committed to your spouse. They never take the rightful place inside your heart. And this is usually hard to recognize because it involves family. So you're thinking, well, this is what families do. They get together, they talk about things. But here are some factors on how your family could be a factor into causing a rift within your marriage. The first thing is there's neglect. And by what I mean by neglect, it means that basically when you are with family, and especially like if I'm with my spouse's family and my spouse is continuing to have a fun time, talk about their family, they're on the phone with their family, always asking for advice from their family. And even at family parties, it seems like they're talking with their family and you as a spouse, you're just kind of on the outside looking in, even though you're in the midst of everything, then that's neglect. The other big factor is that when there is an issue within the marriage, whether it's a financial issue or how are we going to repair this car, or even if it's a big like relationship issue, a lot of times there's a lot of anxiety on your spouse's part to really fix the problem on their own, so they end up going to the family. Now, sometimes it's like, well, what's normal? What would be a normal thing? Well, if we go back to Genesis 3, it is for this reason that a man shall leave his father's house and be united with his wife, and that the two will become one flesh. So in that regards, you're leaving your household. You're leaving your family to start this new family with this person that you call your spouse. And when you do that, really, you should kind of not be always going to your family. Now, is it okay to ask for advice? Yes. If you're at a point where it's like, I really don't know what to do, me and my spouse are fighting, I just really don't know how to handle this, let me get some advice. And really, that's what it should be. It should be advice. So I think out of the 10 years that I've been married to my wife, I think I've only called my parents maybe one, maybe two times for some type of marital advice because I was at the point where I didn't know what to do. But, they offered me advice. They say, well, hey, do this. And then not necessarily do this, but basically a lot of the stuff they say is, and a lot of the times, and this is how you can know, because mostly every time when I go, I don't know what to do, the thing that they say is shut your mouth and listen to your spouse. Pretty much that's the idea. And it's true because sometimes when we're in the heat of battle, it's always about, well, this is how I'm feeling, this is how you're feeling, and it's boo, 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 boo. But really, we talk about we're listening to how I'm feeling and not listening to how my spouse is feeling, and that's kind of where we start to see friction. And a lot of times, and that's the thing, a lot of times what families should do, they should offer advice. They should say, hey, this is what you need to do. But at the same time, they're basically saying, this is your marriage. You're the one that needs to make it work. We are here for you. We support you. But you're the one that has to fix it because it's not our responsibility to fix your marriage or to tell you what to do and how to fix your marriage. We can give you some advice. You could take it or leave it. But really, we're kind of just on the outside of this thing. So that's really how family of origin can happen. So if you feel like that, your family or your spouse's family's getting involved in your marriage, and that's something that needs to be discussed. The next thing is a mental affair. And this is things that happen within the mind. And this could be a plethora of things. This could be at the coworker with the coworker again. You're not really talking to the coworker. Maybe it's just everything in your relationship is professional. It's business is professional. But in your mind, you're thinking of like, oh, it'd be nice if I went on a date with her. Or you might go into a more darker train of thought by thinking of a coworker. Or let's say you're at the gym and you're working out and you see these guys who have like these big ripped muscles, and then you see your husband who's has a little pudginess, and you're like, oh man, about being in a relationship with this other. And a lot of times we hear the saying that it's okay to look, it's not okay to touch. But there's an issue with that, because when you start fantasizing about this other person, then that's when it becomes a mental affair, even though physically it's not happening. And even when we look at things like Matthew 5:27 through 28, we really look at that verse where Jesus is basically saying, you have heard it said, do not commit adultery. But I tell you, if you look at another individual with lustful intentions, then you have committed adultery in your heart. So we see how a mental affair, even though it's not a physical affair, can cause a lot of damage into your relationship. And a lot of times, if we're in our head mentally, that means that we are not present with our spouse. And that means we are not investing emotionally into our spouse, because emotionally we're invested in our head thinking about this other person that we want to be with, when you're not even remotely interested in being physically attached to this other person. So that's how a mental affair could be damaging to the relationship. The fourth thing of a non-sexual affair that people can have is friendship. Now, this may seem like, kind of like with family of origin, this may seem like, well, how can having a good friend interfere with my marriage? Well, frankly, it does happen. It happens more common than what you think. And here's why. Because really, that relationship with your best friend ends up becoming more fulfilling and more emotionally valuable than your spouse is to your marriage. And when there's that investment with friends and you're not getting that investment from your spouse, then that can become trouble. And here's the thing about what good friends do, especially in a marriage relationship. Good friends always respect physical and emotional connection with your spouse. A good friend will always foster a positive relationship with your partner, and they don't get in the way. So, and a lot of times, you could go to friends, you could ask for advice. Maybe there might be some friction with your marriage. So you talk to a friend, you get some advice, but at the same time, they're there to support you. They're there to love you. They're not there to get in the way. And here's kind of how we can see how friendship can really cause damage to your relationship with your spouse. Let's say you guys get together, a big group gathering, and as your spouse is talking, your friend basically is ignoring your spouse, either through actions or words. They don't acknowledge them. They don't look at them in conversations. They may not even say their name. Even if your spouse is talking to them, they may talk, but they may not look at them, or they may talk about something else and totally disregard everything that that person has said. This may even be like when the two of you are together and you're talking and you start talking about your spouse. They may change the topic, or they may say something else, or at the same time, they may, when they talk about your spouse, they only say negative things about your spouse, which again puts those negative thoughts in your head, which then causes a friction in your relationship. So we see how a good friend, how sometimes a friendship could become a non-sexual affair, because it is getting, your friends are getting in the way of the relationship with your significant other. And then the last type of non-sexual affair, and probably another more common one, is visual. And especially with the internet and social media, we have an entire visual library at our fingertips. And usually when I say visual, the most common thing is people who are looking at pornography. They are so invested in pornography that's where they get that attachments, that's where they get that fantasy, and that's where they get that emotional desire from looking at a picture on their computer, on their phone, than actually being stimulated visually from their spouse. The other thing about visual is there's a lot of different apps and sites where everything is about pictures. So you could look at things like Snapchat and Instagram. Even if you look at kind of these dating sites like Plenty of Fish or Tinder or any of these other things that are out there, a lot of times they promote that you have pictures with a profile. So as you're browsing through pictures, there's always that visual thing. And especially we can see how sometimes in real life interactions, when you're looking at pictures of real people who are within your neighborhood, sometimes the visual affair of just looking at this person and even messaging this person through this app can actually lead down the road to actually meeting up, having coffee, and eventually this visual affair then leads to a physical affair. So if you are in a visual affair, one of the things you have to do is make sure anything that you are involved in that's kind of pulling you down or pulling you away from emotionally being invested into your spouse, you need to get rid of it. If you have an app, delete it. If it's a problem with the website, make sure you have accountability software or anti-porn software on your computer to be able to block those websites. And then basically go see counsel. And especially a lot of these things, if there's issues, see a counselor, see a pastor, see if there's a family that's a mentor to you that you and your spouse trust, and they don't want to pay money for a counselor, but they trust this person's or this couple's expertise, then meet with them. Talk about these things. Really make sure that your marriage is super strong, because again, when there's no harmony, these 5 non-sexual affairs can pop up and they can lead to physical affairs, or it can lead to separation and divorce. So you need to kind of really focus on how can I make my marriage strong. And again, there's a lot of great resources out there. A lot of the sources I use when I do counseling is I use William Harley Jr. has a couple of great books. He has Love Busters, which basically talks about the type of things that cause. And his big concept, let me go back. His big concept is that each of us have these banks within us that we make deposits and withdrawals. And every relationship that we have, whether it's with our children, with a coworker, with our friends, with our family, with our spouse, there's always deposits and withdrawals. So Love Buster basically tackles the most common things that actually makes big withdrawals out of your love bank. So that book kind of covers, these are some things that you need to be aware of to make sure that you're not having all these deposits come out. So then you're finding other places to get these deposits within. The other book that he writes is His Needs, Her Needs, where basically that concept is, it's like if you want to have a successful marriage, you need to meet your spouse's needs, and your spouse's needs, and there's like a bunch of different emotional needs that your spouse may have. Very similar to Chapman's 5 Love Languages, but it's a little bit more in depth than that. And he's really good at kind of talking about it. He also has worksheets, so it's good for you and your spouse to go through to figure out what are my emotional needs. So then that way my spouse knows how to meet my emotional needs, how to make deposits into my love bank. So those are like the 2 books that I really recommend to anybody. They're very good. And even like Laura and I, there'd be times where we might just want to read the book again, just because, once we have kids or once we've been married for so many years, a lot of times our emotional needs change with where we are within our lives. So sometimes those change. So number 1 may be number 5, and number 5 may be number 1 now. So you have to kind of see how these things are important to meeting your spouse's needs. So it's always good to kind of go through these books again, just to kind of get a good checkup on what are my spouse's top 3 or 5 needs and how can I meet them. All right, so that's all I have for you today for the on this discussion. Thank you guys so much for those who watched the live video, and for those of you who will be watching the recap once this is posted to our website and Facebook. Again, if you need information about those resources, I'll write them in the comments below, so then that way you can look them up on Amazon or any other bookstore that you like to shop at. All right, guys, thank you so much for watching. I hope you have a wonderful day, and I'll talk to you soon. Bye.